music, media, and place here at Memorial University of Newfoundland. I'm delighted to welcome everyone here this evening to this, our third talk in the Center's 2016-2017 Music Culture Lecture Series. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'd like to make a few announcements. As usual, we are live streaming this lecture from our YouTube channel, and after the talk, we've reserved time for a question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone here in the Center Gallery, and also from those watching and listening via the internet, who can participate by posting questions in our YouTube chat room, or by tweeting questions with the hashtag MMaP Lectures, that's MMaP Lectures. We encourage lively and civil discourse both here in the gallery and in our internet spaces, and look forward to everyone's questions. I offer a particularly warm welcome to everyone at Cape Breton University. Due to heavy winter weather, the Center for Sound Communities at CBU has decided not to open the special viewing room that they have arranged for the live stream of tonight's lecture, but I understand that CBU colleagues will be watching from the safety of their homes. Thanks go to Digital Interns Coordinator Amy McDonald, Center Director Marcia Ostaszewski, and our own Dr. Megan Forsyth for setting up that room, which we hope will be available for our next events. After the talk this evening, there will be a reception here in the MMaP Gallery, to which all of you here are welcome. Two more talks remain in this year's Music Culture Series. Our next address will be delivered Wednesday, March 1st, by Dr. Stephen Friedson, who is University Distinguished Research Professor of Music and Anthropology at the University of North Texas. He will give a lecture entitled The Music Box, Songs of Futility in a Time of Torture. The final talk in this year's series will be given Wednesday, March 15th, by the noted folklorist Dr. Catherine Galloway Young. Her talk is entitled Scrape, Brush, Flick, the Phenomenology of Sound. Both events will be held here in the MMaP Gallery at 7:30 p.m. Newfoundland time, that's 10 p.m. UTC, and live streamed from our YouTube channel. Beyond the lecture series, the Center hosts a wide range of events, and both live and internet mediated. To find out more about what's going on at MMaP, you can visit our homepage at www.mun.ca/mmap. Follow us on Twitter at mmap@memorial. Follow us on Facebook, just search Facebook for MMaP Research Center, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, just search YouTube for MMaP Research Center. If you miss any part of tonight's talk, you can view it from our YouTube channel, where it will be posted in the next few weeks, and also see other videos of past center events. I am delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Ian Sutherland, Dean of the School of Music here at Memorial University of Newfoundland. Dean Sutherland holds a Bachelor's of Music with honors and a Master's of Music in Piano Performance from Memorial University. He received his PhD in Sociology and Philosophy from the University of Exeter, where he studied under the path-breaking sociologist Dr. Tia Denora. Grounded in the sociology of culture, Sutherland is a remarkable scholar whose research has examined a wide range of issues and topics at the intersection of business and the arts. Along with Jonathan Gosling and Stephanie Jones, he's the author of Key Concepts in Leadership, and with Arnold Walravens, is the editor of Artful Leading, MBA essays on art and leadership. His publication, Aesthetics of Power, Why Teaching About Power is Easier Than Learning for Power, and What Business Schools Can Do About It, which he authored with Gosling and Jasna Jelinek, was awarded the prize for the best article of 2015 in the journal Academy of Management and Learning Education. And many of his writings have appeared in a range of prestigious venues that include Organizational Aesthetics, Journal of Arts Management, Law and Society, and Emotion Review. He's the founder of the Arts and Leadership Learning Community of the International Leadership Association, and one of the founding editors of the journal Music and Art in Action. But that is not all. As a pianist, Sutherland has performed throughout North America and Europe. As a speaker, facilitator, and organizational developer, he has worked in over 40 countries, where his expertise is highly sought. The title of his talk this evening is Of Conducting Choirs and Executive Power, Aesthetic Reflexivity to Memories with Momentum. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ian Sutherland.
Thank you, Harry. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Harry, thank you for that, Dr. Berger, thank you for that embarrassing introduction. Thank you. It was nice listening to somebody talk about me like that. Good evening, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming on this beautiful evening of Newfoundland winter weather. I'd like to also welcome, as Dr. Berger did, all those that are joining via webcast who are clearly smarter and more intelligent people than those that are sitting here because you've chosen to experience this in the comfort of your own home. By the way, if you're not here in St. John's, it is snowing like crazy. It's sleet, it's wind, it's ice, it's terrible outside. But it's great to have all of you here. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. Thank you also to your whole team that's put these series of lectures together, continues to do so. Dr. Megan Forsyth is over there on the social media, to Spencer Crew, who heads up all the IT, and all those involved in making this. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a particular pleasure because I get to take off my decanal hat for a while and be an academic again, which is wonderful. And this evening I'm going to be talking about a lot of research that I've done over the last 4 or 5 years, actually probably 5 or 6 years now, that's looked at the practice of arts-based leadership learning, or arts-based learning in the space of leadership. And that may be a big question mark for you right now. Well, what is that? What is arts-based learning and leadership? Hopefully in the next 45 to 50 minutes you'll have a sense of what that is. And the research that I've been looking at that has looked at basically 2 questions. Do people learn anything when they engage with the arts to develop their leadership? And if so, how does that happen? To go through that, I'm going to start with a setup, hopefully to tell you a little bit about what is this arts-based learning thing, because it's something that's grown in the last decade or two, and to also tell you about what kind of makes me tick as a researcher, particularly as a cultural sociologist or a music sociologist. After the setup, I'm going to move to the research itself and talk about some researchy things like research settings, a brief overview of methodology, some of the participant outcomes from these leadership development programs. Then I'll move into the theorizing part, which is what really makes me tick because I'm a boring academic sometimes. But I'll finish by becoming a dean again because I'll step on a soapbox and talk about why I think it's actually quite important that this stuff is happening in the space of leadership development. So let me start with a setup. What gets me ticking, or what fascinates me? As Dr. Berger said, I did my PhD with Professor Dr. Tia Denora at the University of Exeter. Tia, if you happen to be on webcast, hello. Wish I could see you, but hopefully you can see me. And Tia really pioneered within the space of music sociology an idea called, or a concept called musical affordances. And that really fascinates me and still does today. Put in a very basic way, it's what we do with music, what we do through music, and what we do to music. Now, Tia put it in more words than that. In her very well-known book, Music in Everyday Life, she said, music's affordances, things like moods, messages, energy levels, situations, are constituted from within the circumstances of use. Music is active within social life. It has effects, because it offers specific materials to which actors may turn when they engage in the work of organizing social life. And the last sentence, and this is all this quote here, is that music is a resource. It provides affordances for world-building activity. Now, what she's essentially saying there is that music is more than just music. Music is wonderful, as a communicative medium, as an evocative medium, as a emotional medium, as music itself, it's great, but it's a much more present thing in social life and individual life than that. We use it as a resource for things like world building. To unpack that a little bit for you, 3 very simple examples. We use music to regulate our moods. So if we're sad, we may play some music that will help us work through that sadness or maybe even change it to happiness. If we're exercising and we want to go that extra mile, we may play a certain kind of music, listen to a certain kind of music that pushes us seemingly to go that extra mile in our running exercise, for example. It's also sometimes used to influence or control our behavior, such as music played in retail shops at Christmas time that try to get you to spend a little bit more. So music is important in and of itself, but it's also this active ingredient in daily life. And the exploration of that comes through this sort of concept of musical affordances. So we often ask the question as music sociologists, what does music afford? And how does music afford stuff? I brought that lens to this phenomenon of interest, arts-based learning in leadership. So let me give you a sense of what that is. This is a multitude of practices that has developed over the last 10 or 20 years within the space of leadership development and management education, where leadership developers and management educators are using things like mask making, poetry, dance, sculpting, and indeed music, like choral music. And that's why the title for tonight is Conducting Choirs and Executive Power, to help develop leadership. Now, what people that are involved with that practice, and here I need to self-declare myself as having been involved and to an extent still involved in this practice, what people will say is that with the foundations in experiential learning, and I'm reading this quote here, those involved with these approaches argue they have great potential in connecting intellect and emotions, the cognitive, purely logical, rational aspect of human experience and what we do, with our emotional sides as well, to meaningfully challenge norms and assumptions, to give us a space to explore, experience what are our normative modes of behavior and our assumptions about life, and also to be able to challenge those, and to value the relational and subjective aspects of human experience. So through mask making, for example, people will create a mask about how they see themselves. They make that as an object in the world that they can then reflect on. Dance has a lot of leading and following in it. So they talk about the embodiment of leadership and how one may lead and follow. Sculpting, creative activities, making things with the hands. And choral music, a choir is an organization. So how does an organization like a choir work, and how do they interact with their manager, their leader, a conductor? Or indeed, maybe we can demystify the myth of leadership and say that the conductor is not always even the leader. There are a number of choral conductors in the room, so I'm sure you all agree with that. But sometimes you're not leading. There are this variety of practices. Now that does beg the question, well, why? Why would this be? And here I'm going to do a terribly self-aggrandizing thing and really quote myself from an article in 2012 in the journal Management Learning, where I said, management and leadership educators and practitioners are increasingly disenchanted with the traditional means of development and practice. By traditional means of development and practice, I gave this long list right here of adjectives. I should probably change that. There we go. This long list of adjectives: rational, instrumental, economically dominated, realist-oriented, and objectively analytical. Oh, that's a mouthful. Moving on that quote, as Cunliffe has argued, management education fails to consider that practitioners deal with ill-defined, unique, emotive, and complex issues, continuing to employ normative means of teaching and learning based on applying objective, decontextualized theories and techniques. This is a fine example of how academics make a career by using a lot of big words to make ourselves sound smarter than we actually are. Because that whole paragraph basically means what has been done in management education and leadership is not quite cutting the mustard. It's not quite preparing people for the realities of what managing and leading really are in daily life in organizations. Whether we're talking about a company, whether we're talking about a choir, whether we're talking about a school of music, whether we're talking about a university, the types of organizations that we have, they're very complex, and they're not purely rational, they're not purely economic, they're not purely realist, they're not purely analytical things. They are those things, but they're much more. Two of my colleagues, Donald Adkin and Steve Taylor, said this more succinctly than I did, though still somewhat academically obtusely, in this quote here. And they said, "We live in a complex world," no kidding, "which cannot be fully understood solely by reference to scientific forms of logic and sense-making." Now, what lies behind that sentence is saying a lot of management education and leadership development has been based mostly in scientific forms of logic and sense-making, as if we can understand the world purely from a scientific, rational, logical, analytical way. There's value in that. I would never argue against that. There is. But there's more to it than just the rational, scientific, analytical perspectives. Donna and Steve go on to say that the arts and arts-based practices provide different ways of both describing and relating to that complexity, thereby offering novel ways of responding. Now, what they've actually said in that last sentence, provide different ways of both describing and relating to that complexity and offering novel ways of responding, that's an affordances statement. That's a statement that Professor Denora would make. She would say if it was based on some empirical research, that music can afford, art can afford different ways of describing and relating to the complexities of daily life and coming up with new responses, new ways to act within those complexities. Yeah. And as an artist, as a musician myself, I read that sentence and I go, yes, I totally agree. That's absolutely true. I have a PhD in philosophy, so truth doesn't actually exist. But I believe in that statement, you know what I mean? Like that resonates, and those of you here and those of you listening via webcast who are artists would say, yeah, totally, I buy that, I love it, that's great. Yeah. However, for me as a researcher, as an academic, that actually raised a research problem. Because that is a claim that when I first read that in 2010, I found to be unsubstantiated with any empirical evidence, with any real empirical research. So the research problem that I then stated, and here I'll reread a quote that I read before from an article in Advances in Developing Human Resources, but extend it to show the research problem. So arts-based leadership learning practices are based in experiential learning, and I'll unpack that a little bit later. Arts-based learning claims to have great potential in connecting intellect and emotions, to meaningfully challenge norms and assumptions, and to value the relational subjective aspects of human experience. However, and this is the research problem, there is a lack of empirical, participant-focused work exploring the what and how of those practices. So that's what I spent about 4 years doing. I did some other things in those 4 years, but for 4 years I kind of looked at those questions and said, well, there are all these practices, people are doing mask making and choral music and so on, with leadership development. Is there learning happening? And if so, what is being learned? What is being developed? And if there's something being learned and developed, how is that actually happening? Yeah. There is a third element to this, though. Because it's coming from the management and leadership perspective, there's an interest in its impact in professional practice. So there's the what's learning, if anything, how, if there's learning going on, is the learning happening? But there's also the question, is that actually going back into the professional practice and impacting what's going on in companies and schools of music and universities where management and leadership is actually happening? So there's that final question about, is there an impact on professional practice? So that was the research problem that I set out with a number of colleagues, particularly Jasna Jelinek, who was a PhD student of mine. We set out to explore those questions. So now let me move to the researchy stuff. The research setting for a lot of this work was choral workshops, what in the musical world might be thought of as masterclasses. I've been involved with and have observed mask making and poetry and dance and sculpting and so on, but what I'll speak to this evening is entirely based out of workshops that brought business professionals into contact with professional chamber choirs and conductors for leadership learning. Now, what did that research setting look like? Well, there were quite a number of these sites. In fact, there were 15 different observational or workshop points that were involved in this research. And within those, there were sort of two groups of quote-unquote students. All of them, however, were practicing managers. So they were all executives of one form or another in different companies. One group were executive MBA students. So those were managers who were coming back to school to do an MBA. There was another group that were taking a leadership development course that was part of a company training. So they weren't degree students. But the workshops more or less look the same. And these images on the screen kind of depict how those workshops work. So they would start kind of like this. A bunch of people sitting, much like you're all sitting right now, in a classroom setting, set up to do normal learning with your notebook and your laptop and taking notes and you're listening and probably checking Facebook and tweeting and so on instead. So they're in that classroom. And then a choir would join them. A choir would join them. Sometimes they knew the choir was coming, sometimes it was a total surprise. So a choir would join. Then a facilitator would then combine those two groups. So you've got the students sitting, so imagine you're students, and imagine suddenly a choir comes in. They're going to sing, you're going to go, oh, that's interesting. They will then sit amongst you, they'll join you, and then the facilitator would do a little getting to know you exercise so that everybody kind of had a chance to meet people and get to know each other, break the ice kind of thing. Then the business participants, who were either executive MBA students or in an in-company program, would observe the choir at work. So the choir would be sitting amongst them, and then the conductor would come forwards, and the conductor would conduct the choir through a couple of pieces. And the business professionals would observe. They would become kind of ethnographers in a way, observing what's going on. They're looking at what are the choir members doing? How are they connecting with each other? How are they relating to the conductor? How are they doing what they do as quote-unquote work? So they would do that for about a half an hour, maybe an hour. So this observational discussion, dialogue between the business professionals and the musical professionals. The next set of activities would take up the rest of the day. And these workshops typically lasted from about 8 o'clock in the morning till about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of the afternoons, or for 5 or 6 hours, they would go through this masterclass format where the business students would volunteer, and it was always voluntary, volunteer to come up and conduct the choir. Now, these business students were not musicians. None of them were professional musicians. Certainly none of them were conductors. The point was not to make them conductors. That's important to recognize. Some of them certainly had musical education. A lot of this stuff, these workshops happened in Europe. In fact, the vast majority of them happened in Europe, and there's a fairly high general level of musical education in Europe. So a lot of them took piano lessons, had sung in choirs, played the violin, etc. But they were not professional musicians, nor were they conductors. So they would come up and they would conduct. And then the facilitator would work with them to talk about how it was that they led that organization, the choir. Then they would do a lot of things like ask the choir to give the feedback to the conductor, the business student conductor, of how they did, what they observed, what they felt. And the musicians were never saying, your 4 pattern was terrible, your 3 pattern was terrible. They were never saying, you need to show that crescendo differently. They were saying things like, I did not feel connected to you at all. I felt that you were acting like a dictator. I felt like, et cetera, et cetera. So they gave this much more general feedback on leadership and management practices. So that's kind of what those workshops looked like. So just to give you a sense of how we worked with that data. So this was data collected over about a 4-year period. It was dealt with through a grounded theory approach. Now, if you're not familiar with grounded theory as a research approach, in brief, grounded theory is an approach to research that does not test a theory. So we're not taking a theory and testing it to see if it plays out in real life. It is the building of theory from the ground up. So a grounded theory approach says we've got a whole bunch of data, and we're going to look at that data and look for patterns in that data and build codes to categories, to themes, and so on to explain what's going on in this particular instance. So it's about theory building rather than theory testing. And in this project, we had observational data, as I said, from 15 different workshops. We had participant data as reflective writing. So in a lot of these workshops, the participants did some reflective writing afterwards. We had 154 examples of that. There were 92 participant interviews that were done within a day or two after these workshops. There were 63 questionnaires. There were 25 follow-ups and 3 full case studies. I certainly did not do all that data collection myself. I had this wonderful person also working with me. That's Jasna Jelinek, who I've mentioned a few times. She was my PhD student. She finished, so she's now Dr. Jasna Jelinek. Jasna, if you happen to be on webcast, hello. She lives in Croatia. She did a lot of particularly the interviewing parts of this work. And she also worked with this in her PhD, so her PhD was on this topic as well. So with her and with some other colleagues, we collected all this data and we started to work with it. So I want to give you a sense of some of the things that came out of that data. And I want to start with the what. So if I go back to that research problem, there was what, if anything, is being learned, and then how is it being learned, and then does it have an effect on professional practice if there was something happening in the learning? Well, it turns out that yes, people were actually learning stuff. There were insights that came out of this. To give you a sense of what some of those insights look like, I'm just going to highlight 3 categories: embodiment, power, and relationality, or the relational. I want to caution us in this. This is not a finite list of the categories of learning that were happening. In fact, I would probably argue that the categories of learning would be infinite, because everybody that came up and tried the conducting program, that volunteered, had a different experience. And the learning was based upon the experience that they had, so everybody had to varying degrees, different insights or learning that came out. But there were certainly categories of learning that emerged. In terms of embodiment, and I'll just read some of this for you. So this is a quote from Jack. Jack was a senior manager in a company, so he was from an in-company program, not an executive MBA student. And this is what he said about his experience that relates to embodiment, so the connection of the body in leadership. He said, it was a little bit shocking for me. I was nervous, but was nervous because I felt naked. I felt uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable. And well, I think that's a feeling I have a lot, actually. But the music, it helped me connect, to move forwards. After I let go a little, it was like a river that I was being helped by, and then realizing all these people, meaning the choir, are there with me. I don't know. It was incredible. I need to think more to process on that. There's a couple of points I want to draw out of Jack's responses in this interview. One was this very visceral bodily connection to his experience. So his experience was really bodily. He felt physically uncomfortable. Now, he was doing something he'd never done before, so often we feel uncomfortable doing that. But he very much connected that to this uncomfortable physical feeling, and then he started to think, actually, I have that kind of feeling a lot. And he would go on to talk about in his daily practice, when he had to get up and speak to people, he was a manager, when he had to work with groups of people, he had this physical discomfort that was actually causing challenges for him in his ability to manage and to lead. So that's one thing. He comes to these bodily insights. The second thing I want to highlight is what he says at the very end. He says, at this point, and this was probably within 24 hours of the workshop, I don't know. It was incredible. I need to think more to process on that. These experiences often suggested to people that they needed to reflect, think more on this, that they raised certain issues that needed a lot more processing. I think in the learning space, that's quite useful for people to go away with questions as much as any answers that they may find. The second example is relational. So that's the quote on this side from Susan. Now, Susan was an executive MBA student. And Susan said, I felt enormous energy. I felt engaged. Even when I was in the audience listening and looking at others, I was in this bubble with all these people with eye contact, communicating, feeling the energy. Yeah. So she's talking about the relational nature of leadership. The fact that leadership is not about me. It's not a singular individual activity. Leadership requires at least two people. And it's about how we interact with each other. So there's this relational, we would call interstitial space between people, a negotiated space. And she's coming to feel that. That's one thing that I think is important in her quote. The second thing that I think is important in her quote is the aesthetic quality that she's bringing with the language. Now, by aesthetic, and I will use that word quite a lot this evening, I mean felt, sensory, and emotional parts of life, of our experience. So the felt, sensory, and emotional aspects of everyday life. I don't mean judgments of beauty, which is often tied up with this idea of aesthetic as well. But so she's talking about feelings, about senses, about energy. And music and the arts, that's something that they afford. They suggest to us that it's okay to talk about how we feel, to talk about things that might be considered airy-fairy, like energy. And in organizational life, particularly in commercial organizations, companies, it's almost taboo to talk about those kinds of things. So the music kind of suggests that it's okay to talk about that. So Susan had these relational experiences with her experience of conducting the choir. The third one is power, and I'll dwell on power quite a bit this evening. This quote here is from Sarah. I'll refer to Sarah a couple of times because she's quite exemplary of experiences of power in these workshops. Now, a few things you need to know about Sarah. Sarah is a CEO, or at least she was at the time. She was the CEO of a financial institution, a bank, a very large one. She had several thousand employees in the bank, so she's at the top of the hierarchical pyramid, with billions with a B, euros in assets. One would think that somebody in that kind of job is used to power. Billions of euros in assets that you're responsible for, thousands of people that are reporting to you. And her first response to this in the interview was, it was absolutely amazing. They were in front of me, so I was literally surrounded by the music. Having in charge that kind of power gives a very sensational responsibility. And I asked her to talk more about that idea of sensational responsibility. And what she meant was, I felt what responsibility feels like. That I felt responsible. And now I know what responsibility feels like. And I was thinking, we're the CEO of a bank. Anyway, she went on to say, it gives you a completely different way of thinking and feeling. So those are some of the whats that came out. So in answer to the question, was learning happening? Yes. And these are some of the categories that we could fit some of the learning insights into. But for me, as a sociologist of music and culture, the how question is much more interesting. So if learning was happening, how was it happening? I just find that question more fascinating. The what is a bit like, well, I can collect a bunch of stuff and it's categorizing and it's collecting and it's archiving what's been going on. But the how gets us into more the learning processes, the cognitive processes, what's going on there behind how people are learning. So of course, I developed a framework, I developed a theory, concept to describe this. Working from what Sarah said at the very end, it gives you a completely different way of thinking as an impetus to think of what this framework describes. So Sarah says, it gives you. Now I think those are three important words. It gives you. She's saying that that experience, the choral music, the choir, and the conducting, gave her a different way of thinking and feeling. Now if we go back to the very first quote from Tia Denora, she would say, no, because music's power, and I'm paraphrasing Tia Denora now, music's power is not constituted in the music itself, it's constituted in how we interact with that music and the social environment that's around us, the room, the other people that are there. But Sarah believes, and she describes it, that the experience, gave her a different way of thinking. So she's given to that experience a particular agency over herself. And she's using that to actually expand her learning horizons, particularly in leadership, in practice and management. So with that, I started to say, well, how is it that that's happening? How is it that that agency is given to music to develop these insights in leadership? And what I developed was this framework, which is, there is the creation of an aesthetic workspace. Let me remind you, by aesthetic, I mean the felt, sensory, and emotional aspects of life. So the aesthetic workspace is created. So the choir was about to come in here suddenly and start singing. By the way, no choir is going to come in. Start singing. I think we've got all the choral conductors at St. John's sitting on this side of the room anyway. Any of your choirs around, guys? No. But if a choir came in, the aesthetic of this room would change, would it not? Your perception of the feeling of this room would change, dependent upon what the choir was singing, how loud they were singing, how in tune or not they were singing, etc. So there's the creation of the aesthetics of the workspace. And that can, and I'll use that word can a lot, because this is not definitive. It's not going to always be like this. But in an aesthetic workspace, people can be moved into aesthetic reflexivity, and I'll unpack reflexivity in a moment, about 10 minutes. That might develop new forms of knowing, new forms of knowledge. And those new forms of knowledge, particularly because they're connected with music, are particularly memorable. So they become what I've referred to as memories with momentum. Learning memories that actually impact the way we behave in the future. I.e., we don't see automatically. So I want to work with those three concepts: aesthetic workspaces, aesthetic reflexivity, and memories with momentum, to do my theorizing. So let me start with the aesthetic workspaces. We all know this. So the example I just gave of if a choir came in, the aesthetics, the felt, sensory, and emotional aspects of this room and this environment would change. It would no longer be me, supposedly the sage on the stage. Your attention would go somewhere else and we'd feel differently. We know this. We do this all the time with music. So this is an image of a gentleman sitting on probably a subway. Subways tend to be crowded, smelly, unpleasant places, often. If we put on our headphones and we listen to a piece of music that we particularly like, we can turn that into an aesthetic workspace for mood regulation. So choose your favorite relaxing piece of music, whatever that is, whether it's metallic or a Bach, doesn't matter. If you find it relaxing, it's relaxing. Put that on in the subway, and the subway stops kind of being the subway. It becomes this wonderful workspace where you can calm yourself, you can reflect on the day, and so on. So music has these, what Denora has called scenic properties. They can change the environments that we're in and change the kind of work that we can do in those environments. And I think that was exactly what was happening at the start of these kinds of workshops with the choir. So when the choir came in, when the music started, this kind of environment changed. Right? This is a typical classroom. This particular person here is not paying attention at all. This guy's eating noodles. There's some texting going on back here, and I think he's picking his nose. That environment changes when you bring music into that space. Suddenly, it's different. It's almost like the physical parameters of the room can change. Now, it doesn't mean that it will change, but the possibility is there. So when this happens, people get out their phones, start smiling. Well, this guy doesn't look that happy. But it influences how we are constructing together that workspace. Now, I think that happens through three things, or two things primarily, aestheticizing and deroutinizing. The idea of aestheticizing is, again, a good example of why academics use long words, particularly putting ing to existing words to make ourselves sound smarter than we necessarily are. But aestheticizing means it's changing the feelings, the senses, and the emotions of the environment that we're in. And a lot of the respondents in this study said that. So Ella here said, and just the moment the choir entered, the energy and the power was on a very, very high level. So she experienced, the energy level shot up, and it was powerful when the choir came in. Calvin, who was an executive MBA student as well, he said, the music relaxed us, which is totally opposite, actually, in a way, to what Ella said. She said power, energy, and he's saying, oh, actually, I was kind of relaxed. It was great. But it changed. The point is not so much what they felt, but what it did to their perception of the literal classroom that they were actually in. So it relaxed us and put us into a completely different situation than we normally were in at school. Yet they were literally at school. So the presence of the music changed their perception of what the school was. Paula, senior manager, put it even more succinctly. She said it was like we were no longer in a classroom. But literally they were in a classroom. The same classroom that they may have taken finance yesterday. But it was different because there was music and there was a choir there. The second aspect, which comes out of that, is a deroutinizing. So we all have pre-programmed, in a way, pre-programmed ways of behaving with normative behaviors. And as students, whether we are students coming back for an executive MBA or whether we're first years in an undergraduate program at the age of 17 or 18, we have normative ways of approaching learning. They're often passive, by the way. Come in, take notes, and answer questions when you're called upon, but relatively speaking, passive. Not always. But we have these normative behaviors. The presence of the choir really seemed to deroutinize those normative behaviors of learning that were typically exhibited by a lot of these people that experienced this. So Kelly said, it was an unstructured new situation. Stephanie said, the experience was a true and instant trip out of our comfort zones. And Clark, the CEO, said, we had to figure out how to relate. We had to figure out how to act, how to learn. It was totally new. So how is it that we need to relate? How do we act? How do we learn? I couldn't sit and take notes or check my email. So the normative behaviors of learning that would be quickly followed by people in class, you could think those didn't seem to be the right ways to act or behave once the choir had joined this workshop. And they had to figure out, what am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to act? If I'm supposed to learn, how am I supposed to learn? So they're immediately, in a sense, more engaged. Now, I wouldn't say that everybody had this experience, but the majority described these experiences. So with the presence of the choir, the creation of the aesthetic workspace happens through this aestheticizing, the felt, sensory, emotional aspects that are foregrounded, and the deroutinizing of normative behaviors of learning. However, there is definitely manipulation happening here, because these people were not just experiencing the choir with no frame around what they were supposed to experience the choir for, because they were all part of a leadership development class, for example. So the thing was called a leadership development workshop. So they were framed, influenced, suggested to think about this experience in relation to leadership or management. So there was a framing mechanism that was happening. So that's the affording the aesthetic workspace. I think that's interesting, but what I find much more interesting is the aesthetic reflexivity. So what was happening when those normative learning behaviors were challenged turned out to be very reflexive processes. Now here, let me just very briefly overview experiential learning. Because at the very beginning in that one of those longer quotes, I said that arts-based learning, largely speaking, fits into experiential learning. Now, if you're not familiar with experiential learning, let me reduce a huge amount of work pioneered by Kolb and his wife Kolb into one or two sentences. Experiential learning essentially means learning by doing. Isn't that incredibly profound? Learning by doing. Learning from reflections on what we have done and what we have experienced. Now, we normally, as human beings, learn this way anyway. You know, it's how we learn what's hot and what hot means. As a young child, I learned that very quickly when I touched a hot stove and burnt my finger. Don't do that. You know. So we learn by doing all the time. In the Kolb's work, they say we learn particularly well from our experiences, and there's a whole very well-defined cycle of experiential learning and so on that's involved in that. But just as the basics, learn by doing. So essentially, these are environments where people are learning by doing. So they're getting up and they're leading an organization, a totality, a choir in this case. So they're learning by doing. But what's happening there in terms of how the learning is going on seems to be very reflexive, and particularly reflexive around the aesthetics of the experience. So the feelings that they have, the sensations they have, and the emotions that they have. So they start to reflect on those aspects of the experience of learning. So reflexivity is the creation of knowing through the appropriation and transformation of the embodied sensory emotional characteristics of our experience. What? What the heck does that mean? That was a mouthful of really big words. Let me try to explain that a little bit more by quoting some other people. So, reflection is often seen as a systematic thought process concerned with simplifying experience. Reflexivity kind of does the opposite. So reflection takes, we've had an experience, and we reflect on that and reduce it to its basic elements. So it's reducing complexity. Reflexivity actually complexifies thinking. So it's a complexifying thinking or experience by exposing contradictions, by exposing doubts, by exposing dilemmas, and by exposing possibilities. I often distinguish reflection versus reflexivity with an analogy to a mirror. So if you go to a store to buy clothes, you buy your new suit or your new dress or whatever it is you want to try on, and you stand in front of one mirror, you see your reflection. It's sort of a simplification. Here's my one side. But you know those handy-dandy spots where they've got like the 3 or 4 mirrors, and then you stand there, and there's this infinite regression of your image? That's like reflexivity. It's complexifying what you're seeing from all kinds of things, which may be more flattering than others. Gray goes on to say that reflexivity then is a means of reassessing the way one has posed problems and one's orientation to perceiving, believing, and acting. So it's basically a way of challenging your assumptions, challenging your norms, figuring out what it is that you don't know. Bang on about that forever. So my question then is, I think that's what was happening in these cases, and here's how I think it was happening. People first experienced themselves and the other. So the self in the moment and the alterity, the other being, largely speaking, the choir. Oscar, an MBA student, said the following: "When I came and stood in front of the choir, first I took a short time for me, to concentrate on myself, to breathe well, to find the energy connection. So really, who am I? How am I feeling in this moment in time?" Mindful, in a sense. Then, to make eye contact. Now the focus has gone from the self to the other. So who am I in relation to everybody else? I tried to conduct with feeling. I was focused on my hands and how they were moving. To hear the choir was something special. I felt energy, something warm. I was excited. That's quite indicative of what a lot of people said. They first really experienced themselves in that moment with the music, with the choir. Then they experienced themselves in relation to others. And that was sort of the entree into this reflexive activity. The second element of this is the objectifying, or what I've called the objectifying of experience. By objectifying, I don't mean objectification, which might be used in other ideas, like objectifying a particular person, for example. What I mean is literally making an object of the experience, so that when we have an experience, we make it an it. And it becomes like a box that fits the memory. It becomes an object of memory. Clara here, she said, this experience left the biggest impression on me. The reason for that is, in fact, that it was, she's talking about a singularity, really internally oriented, and it made me. There's the idea of giving it agency again. Think about certain things which I do and how I do them, which is an indication of reflexivity. It's not a simplification, it's a questioning, contradictions, doubts, to better understand myself. She's made an object of that experience that she can then use that object to reflect on, to become a reflexive agent, to question herself and what she's doing, how she thinks, how she acts, how she behaves as a leader, based on her experiences through music and the conducting. Carl was much more succinct. He said, it pushed me to think about myself. So the object of the memory, the experience, pushed me to think about myself. And in both cases, and across the data, people gave to that object of experience agency, as if that was acting on them to change their thinking. Finally, they enter into associating experience. And here is where they start to make the connections between the musical experience with the choir and their professional practice, or their other experiences prior to this particular workshop, or indeed their experiences that followed from the workshop, and using the workshop as a point of view. Christine was a senior manager. She said, the exercise was really revealing to me because I never thought that the conductor has such a big role. I don't know what she thought conductors actually did, but I never thought they had a big role. They're not really important, which we all know to be actually true. But I didn't realize, as she goes on to say, I didn't realize how much responsibility managers, now hang on a minute, managers, she was just talking about conductors. She's made that associative link now. Conductors, now I'm thinking about managers in a more business professional, business company kind of setting. I didn't realize how much responsibility managers have with power. This came up again and again and again and again. This idea of, wow, leaders and organizations actually have a lot of power. People were shocked even though they were those people, which I found absolutely fascinating. Managers have with power. And the leadership. And with my own experience, she said, it was really, really revealing. So it's unearthing these assumptions, it's unearthing this contradiction. Sometimes it is imagined that leaders have to lead and have to direct and have to control and control. I'm a dean, I lead, I direct, I control, I control. That's all I do. No, I hope not. Chris goes on to say, very rightly, I think, well, it doesn't work this way. In life, it doesn't work this way. And this exercise of the choir really pointed it out. So by leadership, which is about control, potentially even domination over other people, and saying, actually, it's not like that. And he experienced that with the choir. And I can tell you from observing a lot of these things, and from my own experience of working with choirs, I guess, that there's a lot of the time where you're really not necessarily in control. There's a lot of time you realize that you are absolutely nothing without the rest of the people that are there working with you. Yeah? And these realizations were coming to the fore for Chris. So this whole idea of aesthetic reflexivity is about how they're reflecting on the felt, sensory, and emotional aspects of their experience, and they're going through that process by first experiencing themselves, then the other, self and alterity, then taking that experience an object which they can think on, and then they, through that thinking process, they associate that experience with other experiences that they find relevant and comparable and contradictory and so on. Coming out of that, they get things like the embodiment category that I talked about before, the power category, and the relational category. The idea of memories with momentum. And this is a way of saying it seems that the learning that these people were doing stuck. Now, we did a whole bunch of follow-up interviews, 25 follow-up interviews with a lot of these people. And those follow-up interviews were done 3, 6, or 12 months after they had these initial experiences. There were also 3 case studies done. So we have longer-term data that these learning sticking. And here, I will quote myself one last time. Maybe it's one last time. Where I argue that that's exactly what learning is supposed to be about. So I said, if development programs and education in general are to have lasting impact, the reflexive self-work done must create memory that possibly is future practice. Because all learning gets encoded as a memory. Now that memory can certainly change over time. It doesn't mean it's static. But it needs to create a memory that actually impacts what we do in the future. It's about moving towards reflexivity as a capacity for critically examining one's assumptions, beliefs, values, actions, and effects into the future. But it needs memory with future resonance, i.e. memories with momentum. Now, music seems to be pretty good at this. And I think one of the primary reasons is because music is simply memorable. And the music that happened, the choral music, the sound of whether it was an Ave Maria or whatever it might have been, the sound of that became part of the furnishing of their memories. Different, unusual, and some may have said weird to have a choir in a business school, which no doubt helped make this also memorable. But Carl, just to give you a flavor, said, I am sure that the most memorable experience of my executive MBA was the opportunity to conduct the choir. Paula said, the choir, they sang as angels, I will never forget it. And John, the CEO, said, I was completely surrounded by music. That is unforgettable. But more than them being unique, interesting musical memories, I think that they're memorable because of the reflexive work that's happening. And Kelly said, after experiencing what the choir does, what the choir brings, she went on to talk about beauty. Now for me, the purpose of leadership is to make a difference for the better. It brings up ethical and moral issues of leadership. Now, interestingly enough, ethics and morality were never on the agenda in any of these workshops. For her, the experience got connected to ethics and morality. I think via the experience of beauty, for her in particular. But that's a reflexive memory. Starting her questioning her own leadership practice and what are the implications from an ethical and moral perspective. I'm coming to the end. So as a conceptual summary, I want to return to Tia's quote from the beginning from her book, Music in Everyday Life. Levels, situations, and so on, are constituted from within the circumstances of use. Circumstances of use in these cases were the aesthetic workspaces, and then the aesthetic reflexivity that happened in those workspaces that in some cases created memories with momentum. Music is active within social life. It has effects then because it offers specific material which actively organize life. In these cases, these individuals with these experiences were starting to question their assumptions, their feelings, their beliefs, their values around what leadership is. What are those practices? What does it mean, even from ethical and moral perspectives? And that's world-building activity. Who am I? What's the world like? How do I relate to the world? That framework that I outlined then is a musical experience can afford, and there's that word can, doesn't mean that it necessarily will, but can afford aesthetic workspaces, which arise from aestheticizing and de-routinizing learning environments which in turn can afford aesthetic reflexivity. Through experiencing self and others, objectifying aesthetic knowing with the capacity for memories with momentum, which positively, hopefully, inform future management and leadership practice. If I go back to that quote from Ladkin and Taylor, from which I derived the research problem, they said, we live in a complex world which cannot be fully understood solely by references of logic and sense-making. The arts and arts-based practices provide different ways of both describing and relating to that complexity, thereby offering novel ways of responding. After having collected 4 years' worth of data and so on, at the very end I would simply say, yep, I agree. Which I kind of said before I did all that research. But let me not end this evening without pontificating just a wee bit. So let me stand on the soapbox and take that into really the realm of practice and implications for professional practice. So let me end with this power thing again, because for me, this came up again, the category of power as an outcome came up again and again and again and again. And I found that really fascinating. Would be described as very powerful people, at least in terms of the jobs that they did. CEOs of banks, senior managers, and so on. You would think that they would be used to what it feels like to wield power and to also receive power. But many of them felt that their understandings of power were very contradicted by their experiences in working with a choir and listening and hearing choral music and observing a choir at work. And Sarah, who I've referenced before, had a very powerful experience with regards to that. And her quote is here, and I'll read it for you. She said, after that experience, I am humbled. Those are three important words. For the first time ever, Sarah is the CEO of the bank, thousands of employees, billions of euros of assets. I have a sense of power. For the first time ever. That's interesting. I had no idea what it really felt like. Now, I think that is the most important statement in anything that she said. In the last sentence of the whole quote. I had no idea what it really felt like. Sarah had an MBA. She had a lot of education. But across that education, she never learned anything about what power feels like, what power is like as a lived phenomena in the world. She learned lots of things about how power can be created through structural elements, how it can be used through resource allocation. She learned a lot of scientific, logical, rational ways to understand and structure power. But she never learned what it felt like. And power isn't a very emotional thing. It feels emotional when you wield it. You may love it, or you may feel uncomfortable with it. It also is a very emotional thing when you receive it. When somebody's acting power on you, you know it's happening because you're feeling it. It's a totally emotional thing. But she, at the top of an organization, had never really reflected on that, certainly never been reflexive about that, and felt that she never felt it before. She then went on to say, power may affect good or bad or whatever on others. I just had no sense of it. Now I do. I need to rethink some basic assumptions of what I do at work. Yeah, it was a big impact on me today. And this is the second most important thing she said. I am nothing without those to whom I am responsible. And I think the conductor is often held up as a stereotypical dictator, let's be honest. But conductors, at least good ones, I think, understand that they are the silent musicians, and there really is no music without everybody else. And that experience comes through viscerally for these individuals. Sarah said, I am nothing without those to whom I am responsible. And the things that she's describing there, all of which are coming out of her aesthetic reflexivity, are really important things for people in leaderly positions to at least have an experience of, to have the opportunity to think on. And particularly today, if we look around the world and the geopolitical climate that we find ourselves in, my last statement of this talk is reflexivity, aesthetic reflexivity can go a long, long way. Thank you.
Sutherland, for this fascinating talk. I enjoyed it, as I'm sure everyone here did as well. We have some time for questions, both people here in the audience and in the gallery, and folks coming in from the web. Dr. Megan Forsyth is MMaP's program coordinator, and she'll be serving as social media host this evening. Those watching in the lecture room here and elsewhere can send their questions either through the YouTube chat room or via Twitter and the hashtag MMaP lectures. That's MMaP lectures. But let's begin with a question here. Why don't you pick people and I'll bring the mic to them.
Well, I'm not going to cold call people.
I'm just wondering if there was any effect or if there was any discussion about what kinds of music was performed by the choir, whether it was consonant, whether it was compound time, all this stuff.
Yeah, so, important question. The music always varies. And these workshops, particularly when they got to the business people doing the conducting bit, that lasted for many hours. So there were many, many pieces that were involved, because let's be honest, the choir would get bored singing the same thing over and over again, and everybody else would get bored listening to the same thing over and over again. So there were varied pieces. And the pieces definitely changed. So some were fast, some were slow, some were happy, some were sad, and probably some better adjectives to describe music than that. We did look at that to see if you could map certain insights on certain types of music, but there was really no correlations that we were finding between the physical character, what we might call the quote-unquote physical characteristics of the music, and embodiment or power or relationality or anything else. For example, the power piece that Sarah experienced, I do remember that was actually a very slow Ave Maria. So it was not a powerful, thunderful thing. It was a very slow Ave Maria. That one I do recall, particularly because she cried while she was conducting. And the entire choir cried. Yeah. It was a memory with momentum for me, apparently. Dion?
Okay. I guess to build off that, other than like the physical characteristics of music, I was wondering, participants feel as though like if they were hearing classical music, did that like kind of cultural connotation have an impact on how they were interpreting the space around them? That's very like...
Yeah, my short answer would be yes, because every form of music that we're familiar with has its cultural baggage, if I put it that way. However, the music that they were hearing were the genres also changed. So sometimes it was quote-unquote classical music, sometimes it might have been folk music. There were also examples of pop songs. So there were a number of arrangements of pop songs that were sung. Though they were sung by an ensemble that would typically be the classical music genre in general. But the genres themselves also changed. One thing I would say, however, across this is, in these workshops, it's really important that the music is good. And that's terrible, I can't believe I just said that. Because that just says so much about my own cultural assumptions. But the music that's happening be of a high quality in the genre to which that they were singing. Yeah. So if a choir came in and were singing an Ave Maria, in the SATB classical tradition, and were completely out of tune, and their diction was terrible, and so on, that would not have worked. The genre and the assumptions that belong to that genre. Dr. Gordon?
Thanks, Ian. That was really fascinating. I think it was Henri Bergson who said that music is the only phenomenon through which we can experience the present, which got me thinking about time in these situations. Because though you've created an aesthetic framework in which to have this experience, you've also allowed someone like Sarah the immediacy of experiencing power in real time, getting that reaction to it. Is that something that you looked at?
Yes, definitely. I think this is one of the things that I've within the talk because of time constraints. I have two responses to that. So one is, I think that these situations are so valuable for exploring, kind of like a laboratory for leadership, because it is a situation where you can experience leadership management happening in quote-unquote real time with the entire organization right there. Now, if you're working in a company, if you're a manager in a company, that never happens, because you never see everybody that's responsible to you at the same time and what they're doing all at the same time, and your effect on them at the same time. There's no direct immediacy. So it's a wonderful laboratory for that. Specifically with regards to the power aspect, I think that one of the most valuable experiences or aspects of this experience is the immediacy of the feedback of what you're doing in relation to the power. Yeah. So there were many instances where somebody would start conducting, and they would be what we've called powering, like really exuding very strong power, doing exactly what I'm doing right now, which is kind of weird. I can't believe I'm doing this. Why am I doing this? But really trying to be dictators and control and control and control and control and control. And the choir always, almost always, reacted very negatively to that. And the choir, when asked for feedback, would give them that feedback. And then the person would say, yeah, I kind of sense that because you were all looking at me and hated me. And then they would say, well, actually, sometimes my employees look at me like that. So the immediacy of the feedback of the power also. So I think the time aspect is really important. There is the ability to see the whole organization working in real time, and also the second aspect is the feedback in real time, right in front of you. And it felt in this emotional way. Yes?
This is really, really interesting. One of the things that you haven't touched on, and I'm sure had something to do with it, part of the knowledge of what we're experiencing while we're singing the choral music is the meaning of the words. Did you have different languages, and how cognizant was your audience of what they were actually singing at the time?
Yeah.
How much understanding did they have?
Yeah. Varying degrees, actually. Sometimes there was effort placed in getting the choir to explain, or potentially the conductor, to explain what that piece was about. So they might read the words, but this is a piece about a dance. So, sometimes not, but sometimes the conductors, the volunteer conductors would actually ask. They wanted to know, yeah. But not always. So it was a mix. Sometimes, yes, there was attention paid to that, sometimes not. Sometimes people actively sought it out, and sometimes they didn't.
Question over here.
Hi, this is a question from Monique McGrath, one of our wonderful grad students here. She sees a lot of similarities between the project you've described and what's happening in community music therapy. And she's wondering if you could speak to that and how this type of arts-based research is building bridges between disciplines like music therapy, sociology, and psychology.
Oh, goodness, yeah. There are absolutely connections. So a lot of the things that are done, I don't know why I'm talking to you. I should probably be talking to the camera. Where is that camera? Hi, Monique. There are definitely overlaps with music therapy. So a lot of the things that music therapy affords would be very similar. So the embodiment piece is really important. So a lot of people that avail of music therapy have difficulty in movement, and music helps them move. So people with challenges with conditions like Parkinson's, for example, find that they can actually move better when they're interacting with music than in regular daily life. Theoretical overlap. So a lot of the sociology of music, particularly that stuff that's been done by Professor Denora, is also in the realm of music therapy, particularly community music therapy. So Tia has, for the last number of years, probably about 10 years now, spent a lot of time using this concept of performance to look at what is happening in music therapy sessions. So there's loads of overlap.
Thanks, Ian. That was really fascinating. Loved it. Just a quick question. The have you given any thought since this study, because you had your CEOs and your executives brought in the choir, they showed like experiences there. So have you come away with any ideas or lessons learned that could have an impact on what we know about conducting, choral conducting, and choral music education and the training of conductors and all of that in relation to what we learned from other kinds of leaders?
Whatever. No, I'm kidding. I have. Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, there is. In fact, in many of these cases, though not always, the conductor for the choir was present. So sometimes the facilitator was not the conductor, the facilitator was the conductor. For example, I have facilitated. But in places where the conductor was present, I often had conversations with the conductor afterwards, and the conductor would say, wow, I actually learned a lot. By watching how the choir reacted to that untrained conductor, I noticed things about my choir, their choir. The singers themselves found this very developmental. They found, I think it enriched the bond between the singers and the conductor, whether it was the business conductor or the regular conductor, because they were kind of seeing behind the scenes of what it's like to be a conductor, because they were asked to actively critique. I would say in general, to speak of something with respect to choral education, choral conducting education, that there's probably a lot of value in engaging in leadership development for choral conductors that's not specific to the actual music making itself. Because the study of leadership is huge. It's actually been going on for a few thousand years. And there's a lot of theories and a lot of concepts that would be quite valuable that's not specific to music, that would be really valuable for choral conductors. And that's something that I have thought a number of times. That wouldn't it be great to have more leadership development for choral conductors, given that sometimes they are actually doing leadership.
I have a question from Dr. Holly Everett, a professor in folklore. And she says, thank you. And she says, one of the participants you quote spoke about feeling uncomfortable at first. Did any other participants talk about being discomfited by the experience?
Oh, yeah. Although never in a negative way, interestingly enough. Across all the reflective writings and interviews, lots of talk about being uncomfortable. Always uncomfortable in situations that we're unfamiliar with. That's actually an important thing to have an experience of, because if we're going to go through life with only experiencing things that we're comfortable with, we're not really going to grow and develop very much. So being able to deal with that discomfort, I think, is actually also learning. So yeah, lots of people talked about being uncomfortable, but never in a detrimental way. And they always talked about being uncomfortable as helpful in the learning process, so that they were happy that they felt that discomfort. They were happy that they were able to work through that discomfort. They were happy that they had the courage to try something, experiences with the discomfort. But I think the other thing to remember about that is that none of the participants were ever forced to conduct the choir. Now, there's always social coercion in any setting, of course, but they were all volunteers. So everybody volunteered to conduct. I put it that way, but then worked through it.
I think we might have time for one more question. The room or the chat room?
I would just say Holly added an addendum to her question. She says, I think as musicians, we sometimes assume musical experience to be positive and enjoyable, and not the case.
Yep. Yeah, music can be terrible. Musical experience can be terrible, particularly for musicians. Yeah. No, that's quite, and that's a very important cautionary note that I probably should have foregrounded a little bit more through the talk. That what I've described is not always case. It's not if you for some people it did, for some people it does, but it's not always going to be the case. And there's absolutely every potential, like any form of pedagogy, that some people are going to experience that negatively. Yeah. I would say that the facilitators in this environment, I also speaking as somebody who facilitated these workshops as well, spent a great deal of time making sure at the beginning that the workshop was understood as much as possible as a safe space, so that there was essentially no wrong way to do this, that you weren't going to be punished to do this and so on. A lot of people did talk about that when in the interviews and their reflective essays. They said they really appreciated the fact that this was a safe space to explore, try out, without fear of their boss saying, no, you did that wrong, or their professor saying, no, you did that wrong. Yeah, so the power dynamic of these classrooms we can never say the power dynamic is flat, but were fairly democratized, if I put it that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the I'd like to thank Megan Forsyth, Dr. Forsyth, our social media host, our production director, Spencer Crew, our camera operators, Jing Cha and Jordan Zalis, and all of you for coming out this evening. If you missed any part of tonight's talk, you'll be able to see it from our YouTube channel in the next few weeks, and I look forward to seeing all of you again